Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, it is probably true to say that Brexit at the moment is underpinning or running through almost every aspect of politics and government at the moment. Yesterday, or actually over the weekend, the Prime Minister announced a £20 billion birthday boost, you might say, for the NHS in England. The big question, of course, is how it will be funded. And on the front page of The Times today, which I think we can show you here, it says there's no more money. The Chancellor tells the Cabinet, saying that if all of that money from the Treasury goes to the NHS, then various other Whitehall departments will suffer as a result financially. Well, we're joined now by Gemma Tetlow from the Institute for Government, and Ben Wright is still with us. Welcome again to you, Gemma. What do you make of this front page from Philip Hammond? It is a report, but does it sort of stack up that there wouldn't be any more money left for other departments?
I mean, the story overall does stack up. The context in which this £20 billion for the NHS has been announced is against a backdrop of Philip Hammond wanting to eliminate public borrowing. He has plans to get towards that, but certainly not to achieve that entirely. And at the same time, we've seen the government so far struggling a bit to raise new taxes. We had the reversal of the national insurance increase for the self-employed last year and a fairly quick U-turn on plans to require more private contributions to social care costs in last year's election manifesto. So there is a big question raised by the £20 billion for the NHS of exactly where the money comes from. And Theresa May hinted at the need for tax rises, but there wasn't a lot of detail of that yet. So the question is, does that mean a further squeeze for other departments, and is there any more money to go to them on top of that?
I mean, Damien, listening to all of that yesterday, is there a Brexit dividend?
Well, I wouldn't use the phrase because...
What would you use?
The fact is we don't know, because we don't know the amount of money the Chancellor will have to spend, or the amount he might have to borrow, depends on the state of the economy and the amount of growth we have, which dictates the amount of taxation companies and people can pay. I mean, broadly speaking, it's as simple as that. Now, the effect of Brexit on the economy, most economists are saying it will actually depress growth a bit, though it won't actually lead to the huge recession we were warned was going to happen.
No, but a hit of £15 billion by the government's own figures.
Well, but yeah, I mean, but the government's own figures are looking ahead, guesswork, as well as every other economist figure. So I think the idea that you can say now what the state of the public finances is going to be in 2021-22 is pretty fanciful.
Right. So it was fanciful of the government really to come forward and say this is going to be paid for by a Brexit dividend that you say isn't really there at the moment. We don't know, and against a background of an economy that we don't know how well it's going to do.
All economic projections are fanciful from that point of view. What I do think is that it's clearly sensible for the government to commit to a long-term plan for the NHS, which is well funded, because that's actually what people most care about, and that, I think, is a hugely important step forward by the government.
So it's a political bet?
Well, it's not so much a political bet. It's a democratically elected government responding to the will of the people. That seems to me to be how democracy is supposed to work.
And how would they feel about no money for policing, for schools, for the military?
That's where you get into the discussion about what's growth going to be, what's the balance you want between taxation and borrowing, and where you spend the money that's available. But that's no different from any other spending round I've ever known. That always is the case.
Right. What's the difference here, though, Ben, in terms of a Conservative government, which always likes to pride itself, rightly or wrongly, on being fiscally conservative and prudent with the finances? Has that been thrown out the window?
Well, it's certainly a change of direction to have the idea floating around now for months without any real detail that there are tax rises coming down the road to pay for this commitment. And I think that's something that I think some cabinet ministers might be a bit uncomfortable with, although this plan got, I think, strong support around the cabinet table yesterday. Ministers, I'm told, were also very robust in reminding the Chancellor that there are other areas that require money, from prisons to defence to schools, and he was equally forthright, telling them that that money wasn't going to be available right now. And I think lots of them are waiting for the big spending review that is promised next year to sort of start to put all the bits of the jigsaw in place.
So, Gemma, where would you get that money from in terms of tax rises, or would it be reversing promised tax cuts?
I mean, there are obviously a lot of options. There were some tax cuts announced in last year's election manifesto, and there's been a bit of speculation in the papers today about whether some of those are now back on the table as a way of raising revenues. There is a plan, for example, to cut corporation tax from 19% now down to 17%. If you didn't do that, that would raise you about £5 billion in tax revenues. Arguably, that's a less painful sort of a tax rise by not doing a cut rather than delivering on a rise, but it would be a breaking of a manifesto commitment.
Would you be in favour of that?
I'm not going to pick and choose between tax rises here without knowing all the figures.
But would that be less painful, do you think? Would you agree with Joe? It's less painful than increasing taxes?
It's politically less painful. The reason I wouldn't commit to that is that it's never clear. You always gaily say, if you're not going to cut taxes, then that saves you that amount of money. That assumes you get the same amount of economic activity. And of course, one of the reasons for cutting corporation tax is that you get more successful corporations and therefore you actually raise taxes. The amount of tax collected from corporation tax has gone up while the government's been cutting it over the past few years. Now, the logic of that is that if you stop cutting it, then maybe you don't get all the savings. So,
right.
Sorry, the one other point I would make is just a factual one, that almost the only popular tax rise in history was when the Labour government under Tony Blair increased national insurance specifically to help the NHS. Nobody seemed to mind that.
Right, but do you remember yesterday we showed this tweet, it comes from number 10 Downing Street, their Twitter stream, which says, our long-term plan for the NHS funded by the Brexit dividend, with us as a country contributing a bit more. That's tax rises, isn't it?
Yes, contributing a bit more means paying a bit more tax.
Right. So, I mean, if you're looking at where the options are, politically, is it worth breaking a manifesto promise to increase tax, to pay for the NHS, which you say is politically popular?
Well, actually, the last manifesto was much more careful about ruling out tax rises than previous.
Lower taxes for families and lower taxes for businesses.
Well, I mean, and that's been happening. So there have been tax cuts. Corporation tax has been cut. Personal allowances have been increased.
Sure.
So that manifesto commitment has been met.
Was it responsible of number 10 to say it would be paid for partly out of a Brexit dividend?
Well, the Brexit dividend means that we will not be paying the amount of money to the EU after we leave than we were up to now. So
is there a dividend from that, though, in the next few years?
Whether there is an overall growth in the tax revenue depends on the state of the economy. And those of my colleagues who argue strongly in favour of Brexit say the economy will be released and we'll sign trade deals, so there'll be more money available for government and for the rest of us. Others are more dubious about that.
Right. I mean, listening to Damien, the Brexit dividend has been roundly criticised by all parties, really. Even within the Conservative Party, there are people, as you've just heard Damien saying, that actually we just don't know what it will be, if anything at all.
Yeah, and independent economists are pretty certain there won't be. People like the IFS who say the hit to the economy long term would wipe out any sort of Brexit dividend. Then there's the fact that we'll be paying, additional amounts towards the EU for a number of years for the Brexit bill anyway. I was told this was raised at Cabinet yesterday by some ministers who were making it quite clear to the Chancellor he could forget any idea of a Brexit dividend if there wasn't actually a deal. And this was made quite clear too. What
about the bidding process from other departments? I mean, Damien obviously used to and knows very well what it's like sitting around the Cabinet table as everyone's bidding for that money. Are they now going to be disappointed?
What we don't know quite yet is exactly what that envelope for the spending review next year is going to be. There could be, at the moment, it's pencilled in that overall day-to-day spending on public services will fall, so extra money for the NHS means deeper cuts elsewhere. The question is how much more does Philip Hammond put into that envelope in the autumn before that bidding process starts? But clearly allocating a large chunk of money to the NHS, which is already a big part of public services, makes it more of a scrap for the other departments.
How would you have taken that news if you were still in the Home Office?
I would think we're going to have a battle over the public spending round, but I would have thought that anyway. I mean, Gemma's right. You talk about the envelope at the start of the process. That's the Treasury's opening bid. It's a negotiation.
Oh, right. So you think he'll roll over Philip Hammond then?
I don't think he'll roll over at all. He's a very strong, strong-minded and strong Chancellor of the Exchequer. But, there are plenty of other strong characters. And as I say, this is a normal spending round. It's always like this.
Is it normal, though, if £20 billion has just been promised to the NHS? They've been promised this money now up front, and you've just admitted, as others have, that there is no guaranteed stream for that money as yet. So it's different to other spending rounds. Those other departments now are facing a much tougher battle. Is it right to put all the eggs in one basket?
It's not that different from other spending rounds in that the NHS, I suspect under any government, though I can obviously only comment under Conservative governments, but the NHS is always very high in the list of priorities of any government. All you've got now, as it were, is that one part of the spending review has happened before the rest of the spending review. That's the difference.
Do you agree with that, Gemma, or is it going to be tighter?
I actually do agree with Damien. I think the envelope for this spending review is actually a bit looser overall than we've seen in the last couple of spending reviews. And therefore, even though you're getting more for the NHS, the fact that it's been ring-fenced early on is very similar to what we saw in the last two spending reviews. I think the big difference is that we've already had 8 years of cuts, so all departments are now finding it harder to make that again.
All right. Well, thank you both very much.